All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most incredible, most pivotal military operations in all of modern history, the Normandy Landings. This wasn't just a battle, it was the single day that signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation in Western Europe. It's a story that is an absolute masterclass in strategy, unbelievable sacrifice, and just staggering risk. First, let's just try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this thing. On D-Day alone, you had nearly 200,000 Allied soldiers storming the beaches, and they were backed by a massive armada. We're talking 5,000 ships and 8,000 aircraft. The complexity was just off the charts. And make no mistake, failure would have completely and irrevocably changed the course of the entire war.
So to really understand how this monumental day happened, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the high-stakes plan to end the war itself. Then, we'll uncover the brilliant, almost unbelievable deception that fooled an entire army. After that, we'll see how the whole thing was nearly lost to bad weather. Then we'll witness the brutal assault on the beaches. And finally, we'll explore how this one day ended up planting the seeds for a whole new world order.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How does a plan this huge, this complicated, even get off the ground? Well, it definitely didn't happen overnight. The strategy was actually forged months and months earlier in a super high-stakes meeting between the three most powerful men in the world, who were all laser-focused on orchestrating the final, decisive phase of the war.
The whole road to D-Day really began at the Tehran Conference in late 1943. This is where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin got together and agreed on a decisive strategy. You could call it a massive, coordinated squeeze. The idea was, as the Western Allies prepared to punch a hole through France, the Soviets would launch a huge offensive from the east. This would force the German war machine to fight a grueling war on two fronts, stretching its resources to the breaking point.
And this grand plan? It had a code name, Operation Overlord. The objective was incredibly ambitious, but it was crystal clear. Smash into northwest France, secure a solid foothold, and then begin a relentless, grinding push across Western Europe, driving the German army all the way back to Berlin.
Now, Overlord itself was actually broken down into two very distinct phases. The first part was called Operation Neptune. That was D-Day itself. The whole focus was on getting across the English Channel and securing those beaches. Once that was done, and only then would Phase 2 begin, the broader Battle of Normandy, which had the ultimate goal of liberating all of France. But, this was not an easy decision for everyone. Winston Churchill, in particular, was absolutely haunted by the memory of the Gallipoli campaign from World War I. That was a similarly massive amphibious assault that ended in just catastrophic failure and horrific casualties. As he put it, the terrible consequences of that day really weighed on him. He was terrified of a repeat, and this time the stakes were even higher.
So with those kinds of stakes, the Allies knew that just brute force was not going to be enough. They had to outsmart the enemy before a single soldier even touched the sand. They needed a secret weapon, and that weapon was deception, on a scale that is just mind-boggling.
So, think about what they were up against. The primary obstacle was Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a nearly 4,500-kilometer line of fortifications, concrete bunkers, and an estimated 6 million mines. It was designed to be completely impenetrable. But Allied reconnaissance spotted a critical flaw. Because German resources were stretched so thin, a staggering 80% of this supposedly mighty wall was incomplete. This was the crack in the armor the Allies were looking for. Okay, this slide is just fascinating because it breaks down the brilliant deception which was codenamed Operation Fortitude. So, look at the left column. That was the ruse. The Allies built a massive ghost army in southeast England, right across from Pas de Calais, using things like inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter. They even put the famous General Patton in charge, a commander the Germans deeply respected and feared. Now, look at the right column. That was the real target, Normandy. While the German high command was staring at this phantom army, the real invasion force was getting ready to hit the much less fortified beaches. It was this massive, elaborate stage play, and the Germans bought the performance hook, line, and sinker. But even with the most meticulous planning in the world and this brilliant deception in place, there was one powerful, unpredictable variable that no general could command: the weather. The success of this entire invasion hinged on an incredibly specific and rare set of conditions. They had to land at dawn.
They needed a low tide to expose all the German beach obstacles. The paratroopers who were dropping in behind enemy lines needed a full moon to see where they were going, and of course they needed light winds and low waves for the thousands of ships crossing the channel. It was just this incredibly delicate balancing act. And this right here is where the fate of the war literally came down to two competing weather forecasts. Allied meteorologists saw a brief, fragile little window of acceptable weather opening up on June 6th. But in contrast, German forecasters confidently predicted the storms would continue, making an invasion completely impossible. Their forecast was so certain that senior German officers actually left their posts. Incredibly, Field Marshal Rommel, the brilliant commander in charge of the defenses, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. The weather had just handed the Allies the ultimate element of surprise.
And so, with that narrow window in the weather, General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, gave the final, momentous order. After years of planning, the assault on Fortress Europe was finally on.
The assault wasn't focused on just one single point. It was spread across 5 designated landing zones along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. You had the American forces assigned to Utah and Omaha beaches, while the British and Canadian forces were tasked with taking Gold, Juno, and Sword. For the American forces, the day really became a tale of 2 completely different wars. As you can see on the left, Utah Beach was, relatively speaking, a swift success. The defenses were light, the bombing was effective, and casualties were low. But Omaha Beach, on the right, that was a vision of hell. It became an absolute killing field. Soldiers were just torn apart by machine gun fire as they struggled across 450 meters of open sand, all while facing heavily fortified cliffs. On that one beach, the entire invasion teetered on the brink of total failure. Meanwhile, over at the Commonwealth beaches, the British forces at Gold Beach made really rapid progress, pushing almost 10 kilometers inland. Over at Juno, the Canadian troops battled their way through fortified houses and tunnels to secure their objectives. And at Sword Beach, the British managed to secure the beach in just 45 minutes, but then they had to fend off the only significant German armored counterattack of the entire day, and they successfully held their ground.
So, despite the absolute chaos, the brutal fighting, and the terrible losses, especially at Omaha, by the end of June 6th, the operation had succeeded beyond what many had dared to hope. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress, had been breached.
And this slide perfectly illustrates why that ghost army deception was so absolutely crucial. By late afternoon on D-Day, the Allies had a solid foothold. And yet, Hitler was still completely convinced that this was all just a diversion. He believed the real invasion was coming at Calais, so he refused to release his critical panzer tank divisions to Normandy. That delay, a delay caused by a phantom army of inflatable tanks, was a fatal mistake. By the time he finally realized what was happening, it was far too late. You can just see how D-Day's success triggered this rapid chain of events. Just days later, Churchill himself was walking on the beaches of Normandy. By August, Paris was liberated. And by the following February, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were meeting again at Yalta, but this time they weren't planning an invasion. They were deciding the fate of a defeated Germany and trying to shape the entire post-war world. And this really brings us to the final, crucial takeaway. While D-Day was, without a doubt, the beginning of the end for World War II in Europe, the political agreements that came after it created a brand new reality. The decisions that were made at Yalta ended up dividing a continent, drawing what became known as an Iron Curtain across Europe. This would set the stage for the next global struggle, the Cold War. The victory that began on the beaches of Normandy reshaped our world in ways no one could have fully imagined, planting the seeds of one conflict right in the ashes of another.